You've probably used the dollar before, maybe not even directly, but somehow it always shows up. Fuel prices, international payments, even some things you buy online, the dollar is always there. But let me ask you something. Have you ever actually stopped and thought about it? Like, why is it the US dollar? Why not the euro or the pound or even something completely different? Because if we're being honest, it's not just a normal currency. The dollar has this kind of invisible power, the kind that quietly affects countries, businesses, even entire economies. And the crazy part is most people just accept it. Nobody really questions it. It's just that's how the world works. See, it didn't just start like that. The dollar didn't just wake up one day and become the most powerful currency in the world. There was a beginning, there were decisions, there were moments where everything could have gone in a completely different direction. And if those moments played out differently, the world you are living in right now might look very different. Because behind the dollar, there's a story most people don't know. A story involving power, war, agreements, and control. And once you see it clearly, you start to understand something most people completely miss. The dollar isn't just money. I'm going to take you through how it all began and how one country's currency ended up influencing the entire world. Hit the subscribe button in order to get notified on exclusive and thrilling documentaries like this. This is Ancestral Lens. Now, before we even talk about the dollar, you need to understand something first. There was a time when the world didn't have one dominant currency. There was no dollar, no global system, and no single standard. It was messy. Different countries used different forms of money. Some used gold, some used silver, some even used a mix of both. And on paper, that sounds fine. But in reality, it made trade very complicated. Imagine you're a merchant back then. You leave your country with goods to sell, but when you get to another country, your money might not even be accepted, or worse, is accepted but at a completely different value. So every transaction becomes a negotiation, every deal becomes stressful, and the bigger the trade becomes globally, the bigger this problem gets. Now, at some point, countries started realizing something important. If trade is going to grow, there has to be some kind of order, some kind of system people can trust, and that's where gold started playing a major role, not just as wealth but as a standard. This became known as the gold standard. I know you might be thinking that, what was the gold standard? This is it. Instead of money just being paper, countries began tying their currency to gold. So basically, if you had money, you could exchange it for a fixed amount of gold. That created trust, because now, money wasn't just paper. It had something real backing it, something everyone agreed had value. And this system started spreading. By the late 1800s, many major economies were using it. And for a while, it actually worked. Trade became easier. Exchange rates became more stable. And for the first time, there was some kind of structure to global finance. But here's the thing, systems like this only work when everything is stable. And the world was about to enter a period where stability didn't exist anymore. Because in the early 1900s, everything changed. There was war, and not just any war, but a war that would affect almost every major country. I'm talking about the World War I. When the war started in 1914, countries needed money, a lot of it. They needed it to fund armies, to buy weapons, and to survive. And here's the problem. Under the gold standard, you can't just print unlimited money, because every unit of currency is supposed to be backed by gold. So governments faced a choice: stick to the system or break it to survive. And most of them chose survival. They started printing more money, spending more, borrowing more, and slowly that trust in the system started breaking down. By the time the war ended in 1918, things were no longer the same. The gold standard was weakened, economies were damaged, and countries were struggling to recover. And this is where things start getting really interesting, because while most countries were struggling after the war, one country was in a very different position. A country that hadn't been destroyed, a country that was actually gaining power. Guess the country? You're right. That country was the United States. Now at this point, the dollar still wasn't the dollar we know today. It wasn't controlling the world, but something was starting to shift, because while others were trying to rebuild, the US was rising economically, financially, and even globally. And this moment right here is where the foundation of the dollar's future power was quietly being built. Most people don't notice it because it didn't happen overnight, but this is where the story really begins. From here, the dollar doesn't just exist anymore. It starts positioning itself, and the world doesn't even realize what's coming. Now, After the World War One ended, most countries were in a bad position. Economies were damaged, infrastructure was destroyed, and governments were deep in debt. Countries like United Kingdom, France, and Germany had spent huge amounts of money fighting the war, and now they needed help to recover. While all of that was happening in Europe, the United States was in a very different position. The war didn't destroy its land, its economy was still functioning. In fact, it actually benefited in some ways, because during the war, European countries were buying supplies from the US, including weapons, food, and resources. They weren't paying immediately, they were borrowing. So by the time the war ended, something very important had changed. The US was no longer just another country in the system. It had become a creditor, meaning other countries owed its money, a lot of money. Now think about how power works. If multiple countries owe you money, you are not just a participant in the system anymore. You start influencing it quietly without needing to announce anything. And that's exactly what started happening. Before this period, the global financial system was largely influenced by the British pound. Pound sterling was one of the strongest currencies in the world. London was a major financial center, and Britain had global influence. But after the war, that dominance started weakening, because now Britain itself was struggling with debt, economic pressure, and recovery challenges, and at the same time, the US was rising, slowly taking a stronger position. Power in money is not just about who has it, it's about who people trust, and after the war, trust started shifting. If you're a country trying to rebuild, who do you trust more? A country that is struggling, or a country that is stable, growing, and financially strong? That's how the US dollar began gaining attention, not because it was first on anyone, but because it started looking more reliable, more stable, and more secure. Even with all this, the world still didn't have a perfect system. The gold standard was weakened, currencies were unstable, countries were trying different solutions. Some succeeded temporarily while some didn't, and then things got even worse, because just when the world was trying to recover, another major crisis hit. This is the Great Depression. In 1929, financial markets crashed, businesses failed, banks collapsed, unemployment skyrocketed, and this wasn't just one country, it spread globally. Now imagine you've just come out of a world war, you're trying to rebuild, and suddenly your entire financial system starts collapsing again. At this point, the idea of a stable global system was almost gone. Trust was low, confidence was low, and countries were starting to focus on themselves, protecting their own economies, trying to survive. But even in the middle of all this chaos, one thing was becoming clearer. The world needed something stable, something reliable, something everyone could agree on, because without that, global trade, growth, and recovery would always be unstable. And this is where the story starts moving towards a major turning point. Because after another global crisis and another war, the world would finally sit down and decide, enough of this chaos, we need a system. And when that moment comes, one currency ends up at the center of it all, the dollar. But the way it got there, that's the part most people don't fully understand. Now, everything we've talked about so far, including the wars, the instability, the collapse of systems, all of it was leading to one moment. Because after the World War II, the world was in an even worse condition than before. And at this point, everyone understood something clearly. We cannot keep doing this. We cannot keep going from one crisis to another with no stable system. Something had to change, and this time, they wanted to get it right. So, in July 1944, before World War II had even officially ended, 44 countries came together in one place, Bretton Woods. This wasn't just a normal meeting, this was a decision-making moment. The goal was simple: create a system that would bring stability to the global economy, a system that would prevent future chaos, a system that countries could trust. But here's the real issue they had to solve. If the world is going to have a stable system, what will it be built on? What currency? What standard? Because remember, before all of this, gold was the main anchor. But now, gold alone wasn't enough to run a modern global system, so they needed something else, something stronger and something more practical. Now think about the situation at that time. Which country was in the strongest position after the war? Not Europe,
not Asia, it was the United States. Its economy was strong, its infrastructure was intact, and most importantly, it held a huge portion of the world's gold reserves. So when time came to decide the new system, the US had a lot of leverage. So here's what they agreed on. Instead of every country tying their currency directly to gold, they would tie their currencies to the US dollar, and then the US dollar itself will be tied to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce of gold. Now pause and think about that. This was a huge decision because it meant one thing: the dollar became the center of the system. Every other currency was connected to it. And because the dollar was backed by gold, people trusted it. This system made things simpler. There were stable exchange rates, predictable trade, and more confidence globally. Countries could now trade more easily, plan their economies better, rely on a structured system, and for a while, it worked really well. Global trade expanded, economies started recovering, growth increased, and the dollar became stronger and stronger. This wasn't just about stability, it also gave the US a very unique position, because if every country is holding dollars and using dollars, then the US isn't just participating in the global system anymore. It is sitting at the center of it, quietly influencing it without needing to control everything directly. From this point on, the dollar wasn't just a currency, it became a tool of global influence. Now, like every system, this one had a weakness, because for this to work, the US had to maintain something very important: trust. Countries needed to believe that if we hold dollars, we can always exchange them for gold. But over time, something started happening. The US began spending more, they began printing more money, and slowly, the amount of dollars in the world started increasing faster than the gold backing it. If too many dollars exist but gold remains limited, then the system starts getting shaky, and that's exactly what began happening. But most people didn't notice it immediately, because on the surface everything still looked stable, until one moment when everything changed again, and this time it completely reshaped the power of the dollar, because the system that made the dollar strong was about to collapse, and what replaced it? That's what makes the dollar even more powerful today. Now, up until this point, the system made sense. Countries trusted the dollar because the dollar was backed by gold. Simple. If you had dollars, you could exchange them for real gold. That was the foundation, that was the trust. But here's the problem. Over time, the United States started spending more and more money. Wars, government programs, and global commitments, all of which required money. And instead of limiting spending, more dollars were being created. If the amount of dollars keeps increasing but the amount of gold stays the same, what happens? The balance breaks. By the late 1960s, other countries started noticing something. They were holding a lot of US dollars, but they weren't fully sure anymore if all those dollars could actually be exchanged for gold. That trust started shaking, so some countries made a move. Instead of holding dollars, they began demanding gold in exchange. One of the most notable was Charles de Gaulle of France. He openly questioned the system, and he didn't just talk. He acted. France started converting its dollar reserves into gold. Now imagine that happening on a larger scale. Multiple countries doing the same thing all at once. That would completely drain US gold reserves. And if that happens, the whole system collapses. So in 1971, the United States made a decision, a very bold one. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on TV and made an announcement. The US would no longer allow the dollar to be converted into gold. Just like that. No negotiation, no gradual transition. The link between the dollar and gold was cut. This was really huge. For years, the entire system was built on one idea, which states that the dollar equals to gold. And now suddenly, that idea was gone. So logically, you would expect people to panic. You would expect countries to stop trusting the dollar. You would expect the system to collapse completely, right? The collapse didn't happen the way people expected. The dollar didn't disappear. It didn't lose all its power. Instead, it adapted, and somehow it stayed at the center of the system. If the dollar is no longer backed by gold, then what is backing it? Why are countries still using it? Why didn't the world switch to something else? What changed in 1971 wasn't just a policy, it was the foundation of money itself. Before, money equals something tied to value, which is gold. After, money equals something people agree has value. That's a big shift, and for something like that to work, you need confidence, global confidence, and somehow the US managed to keep that confidence alive. But how? This is the moment where the dollar should have fallen, but instead it became even more dominant in the years that followed. And that didn't happen by accident. There were decisions, strategies, and agreements. Things happening behind the scenes that most people don't talk about. The dollar wasn't backed by gold anymore. It was backed by something else, something just as powerful. And this is what truly explains why the dollar still controls the world today. Now remember the situation after 1971. The dollar was no longer backed by gold, so naturally a big question was hanging in the air. Why should the world still trust it? At this point, nothing physical was backing the dollar anymore, just belief, and belief alone is risky. So the United States needed something else, something strong enough to keep global demand for the dollar alive. And this is where things take a very strategic turn. Now think about one thing every country needs: that's energy. And for decades, oil has been at the center of that. Whether it's transportation, industry, or electricity, oil touches almost everything. So if you can somehow control how oil is traded, you're not just influencing one sector, you're influencing the entire global economy. In the early 1970s, not long after the dollar left the gold standard, the United States made a very important move. It reached an agreement with a major oil-producing country, Saudi Arabia. The understanding was simple but powerful. Saudi Arabia would sell its oil only in US dollars, not in pounds, not in euros, and not in any other currency, only dollars. If oil, the most important global resource, is priced in dollars, then every country that needs oil must have dollars. It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter your economy. If you want oil, you need dollars. This created a ripple effect. Countries around the world started holding dollar reserves, not because they wanted to, but because they had to buy oil, to trade internationally, and to stay connected to the global economy. It didn't stop there. Other oil-producing nations followed the same system, which meant one thing: the dollar became unavoidable. Even without gold, the dollar had something else backing it, which is demand. Think about it like this: if the whole world needs your currency to function, the currency automatically gains power, and not just financial power, it gains influence too. Now, decisions made in the US can affect economies far beyond its borders. This system didn't just support the dollar, it reinforced its position at the center of everything: trade, energy, finance, all connected back to one currency. And over time, this created a kind of cycle. Countries earn in dollars, they use dollars, they store dollars, they depend on dollars. And once that cycle is established, it is very hard to break. So even without gold, the dollar got stronger. Let's go back to that moment in 1971 when the dollar lost its link to gold. That should have weakened it, but instead, this new system gave it something even more powerful. And this is why it still matters today, because decades later, this system still influences how the world operates, including oil prices, global trade, and currency reserves. All of it connects back in some way. And that's why even when people question the dollar, it doesn't just collapse, because it's not standing alone. It's supported by an entire system, a system that most people don't even realize exists. If the dollar's power comes from this system, then what happens if the system starts changing? What happens if countries begin to move away from it? What happens if oil is no longer tied only to the dollar? Because that is where the future of the dollar becomes uncertain, and that's where the story is heading next. So after everything we've talked about, from gold to war to agreement and finally to oil, you start to see something clearly. The dollar didn't just become powerful by accident. It was built step by step through moments where the world needed stability and one country was in the right position to provide it. It might interest you to know that we are still living inside that system today, but at the same time, you can start to see small changes happening. Now, more countries are beginning to ask, do we really have to depend on the dollar this much? Because think about it, if your entire economy depends on a currency you don't control, that's a risk. So slowly, some countries are trying to reduce that dependence, trading in their own currencies, building new financial agreements, looking for alternatives, not overnight, not aggressively, but just gradually. Even with all that, the dollar is still dominant. It's still used in global trade. It's still held in reserves, still trusted more than most other currencies. And that's not easy to replace, because it's not just about switching currencies, it's about replacing an entire system. And systems like this don't disappear quickly. On one side, you have a stable, trusted system that has been working for decades. It is deeply connected to everything. On the other side, you have a world that is slowly changing, new powers rising, new ideas forming, and new questions being asked.
The dollar's power isn't just about money, it's about influence, the ability to shape global decisions without needing direct control. And once you understand that, you start seeing things differently. You start noticing how connected everything is. So when people say it's just money, it's really not. Because behind the dollar, there's a story of power, decisions, timing, and systems built over decades. And even today, that story is still evolving. So maybe the real question isn't just how did the dollar become so powerful, but how long can it stay that way?